Hello and welcome to Recap Radio. I'm Diego Cupolo, editor-in-chief of Turkey Recap, and this is our live show about Turkish politics and foreign policy. Today I'm talking to Gallia Lindenstrauss, a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, which is an independent think tank affiliated with Tel Aviv University in Israel. Hi, Gallia. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, thank you. I'm really honored to be here. I'm a great fan of Turkey Recap for so long and couldn't be happier to be with you.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to talk to you face to face, even if we're doing it through digital means. We've been talking for many years about Israeli-Turkish relations, and I'm looking forward to talking about them more deeply today in this podcast. So basically, we're going to review and discuss Israeli-Turkey relations through the lens of the Israel-Iran war, developments in Syria, the PKK peace process, the Gaza war, Hamas, and more. And we're going to do this as simplistically as we can. It's not a simple topic, but I do believe that it requires some discussion in terms that people can understand, because many things are happening in the region, and it's good to understand what's happening before the next big event, is my personal view. And part of the reason why we do Turkey Recap is to just break down what's actually going on. So before we get into it, quick history. Turkish-Israeli relations have gone through many ups and downs, but better days saw Israeli pilots train in Turkish airspace, and Turkey's intelligence operatives train in Israel under various security cooperation agreements. That was until Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan had a 1-minute confrontation with former Israeli President Shimon Peres at Davos in 2009. And that was before the Mavi Marmara incident in 2010, when Israeli forces raided an aid ship, killing 10 Turkish origin activists. Relations soured for more than a decade after those events. And then in September 2023, Erdoğan and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu met to try and improve relations. That was just days before the October 7th attacks reset the region. Since then, Erdoğan and much of the Turkish establishment has condemned Israeli actions against Palestinians, organizing pro-Palestine rallies and marches in different forms. And most recently, during the Israel-Iran war in June, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan hosted the Organization of Islamic Cooperation Summit in Istanbul. And as part of his address, he said, quote, "Israel is now leading the region to the brink of total disaster by attacking Iran, our neighbor." He added, quote, "There is no Palestinian, Lebanese, Syrian, Yemeni, or Iranian problem, but there is clearly an Israeli problem." So we've got a lot to cover. Before we start, let me restate this is a live recording with a live audience. People listening to us are welcome to send questions as we talk. You can submit questions on Substack. And we aim to talk about 45 minutes to an hour. Now, Gallia, to start, Turkish politicians and commentators talk a lot about Israel. How much do Israeli politicians and commentators talk about Turkey?
Well, Turkey is a fascinating country, as you well know. And everybody in Israel knows who Erdoğan is. So in this respect, there's definitely clear interest in Israel in Turkey. But I think since the events in Syria, since the toppling of Assad in Syria, the interest in Turkey has grown. And when I tried to analyze it, I think that some people were not paying attention to what Turkey was doing before, because many of the things we're seeing Turkey doing is processes that began well before 2024. And I think some people are seeing stuff that, again, existed before and exaggerating their meaning. So definitely Turkey is a source of interest in Israel. But as you know, Israel has a full plate of security issues and, of course, other issues inside the country. Usually the interest in Turkey is when there's something done on the Turkish side, when Erdoğan makes a certain statement, then a certain move, and then Israel politicians and commentators react.
So most recently with the Iran-Israel war, there's been a lot of talk about Turkey being impacted directly, maybe becoming a target of Israel at one point. Nationalist Movement Party Chair Devlet Bahçeli said in one of his many speeches that Israel's expanding war may someday threaten Turkey. So often this is framed as exaggerated because Israel and Turkey are both U.S. allies and Turkey is a NATO member. But Iran analyst Vali Nasser suggested it's quite justified to fear Israel's war footing in Turkey. He said this while speaking to Amber and Zaman on the Monitor podcast. So how do you see it? Will there be someday in the near to midterm Israeli military action against Turkey, maybe in Syria or elsewhere?
I have to say, in April, when there was an Israeli attack on the T4 airbase in Syria, and the explanation was that Israel did not want this to be a Turkish airbase, I was actually distressed. Personally, I was distressed. I've been dealing with Turkey for 20 years. Most of my work was also to improve Turkish-Israeli relations over the years, and I was personally really distressed. But then we had the deconfliction talks in Baku. We had several rounds of deconfliction talks in Baku. A hotline was established. And we had now the 12-day war between Israel and Iran. And there was supposedly refueling the Israeli aircrafts done over Syrian airspace. And we didn't have a confrontation between Israeli and Turkish jets. So that actually a little bit reassured me. I'm more relaxed today than I was in April. I think also it's very hard as analysts and commentators to assess where we're going, because I think the current weeks are very critical. If President Trump manages to accomplish what he wants to accomplish, meaning enlargement of the Abraham Accords to include additional countries, also, for example, Syria and Lebanon, achieving a ceasefire in Gaza, achieving a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, will be in a very different place than we were a few months ago. Because if we do achieve such a normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, it will have a Palestinian component. And once we have some relaxation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we know historically that this will also have the benefit of an improved relationship between Turkey and Israel. I mean, there is a correlation. When there is a crisis between Israel and the Palestinians, also relations between Turkey and Israel deteriorated, and vice versa. The honeymoon years between Turkey and Israel in the 1990s correlated with the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinians. So I still don't know where things are going. Of course, I hope they're going into a good place. But if there will be such a relaxation in the Palestinian issue, and if also Israel will achieve understanding with the new regime in Syria, and it also things are looking quite well in this respect, I think we'll be in less tension between Israel and Turkey.
And I know that things aren't defined right now in Israel and what the government objectives are after the war with Iran and this ongoing ceasefire. It's very unclear. I understand that. But can you somewhat outline what the Israeli government's objectives are regarding regional security right now? What are they trying to achieve?
So I think what we should talk about is, in this context, is Netanyahu's heritage. I mean, Netanyahu might be with us still for a few more years, but he is trying to somehow overcome what happened in October 7th. His legacy has been tainted by this awful event, and he's trying to build his heritage. So part of this was the successful strikes in Iran. For him, this was the threat he was always preparing for. This was the thing he had to save Israel from, and supposedly he did it. But he wants another layer to this, and the other layer to this is the normalization with Saudi Arabia. So I think he wants this. Of course, he has a coalition government, and in his coalition government, there are very extreme elements that are pushing for another direction. But if he could do that, he would want to do that.
But in the region more broadly, commentators tend to suggest that Israel's looking to become the leading military power in the Middle East and basically deal with either weak states or states that won't pose a threat to its own existence. Would you say that's accurate?
I think people are way exaggerating Israel's ambitions. I think people are treating Israel as it's omnipotent, and let's put things in proportion. Israel is it's a small state geographically. I checked earlier in an AI, and Turkey is 36 times larger than Israel geographically. It's only 8 times larger in population. We're a very small country geographically. We're not that small in population. That's true. We're growing. But it's a small country. It has a lot of security threats. I live in Tel Aviv. I live in central Tel Aviv, but I had to go to the shelter with my kids because of missiles from 4 different directions, from the Houthis, from the Hamas, from Hezbollah, and from Iran. They did cause damage also, some of these missiles. There are problems in Israel that some part of the population is not drafted to the army, the ultra-Orthodox, which are growing in numbers. They don't go to the army. Israel is limited in its capabilities. I think definitely our main threat is Iran and Netanyahu, and of course in Iran's nuclear military program is the big problem in from Israeli perspective. So we still there's differing views of how much damage has occurred to the Iranian nuclear program, but that is the main issue. And of course, there's the Palestinian issue, which if you see Israel's operations in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iran, they're rather contained, right? They're not. They were more limited in the time frame. They were. And Israel is looking like a more rational actor with regard to these conflicts. With regard to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it's a more emotional, a more difficult issue to solve. And here, definitely, things are more complicated.
Yeah. I understand. So, I mean, as a person that focuses on Turkey, and we often talk about Israel in different ways, I'm really interested to understand how the perception of Israel is different in Turkey than it is in other Arab countries and other neighbors of Israel, because I know what it is here in Ankara, and Erdogan speaks often about Gaza, about humanitarian causes. We'll get more into it as we keep talking. But what's the difference between Turkey's activism, let's say, in this Gaza war, and Arab countries' discourse and activism?
So when I give lectures to, usually it's the Israeli audience on Turkish-Israeli relations, and when I gave these lectures after the Abraham Accords in 2020, when the term normalization there was a lot of hype around the term normalization, I used to say to the audience, I would say, the first country that normalized relations with Israel was Turkey, because Turkey recognizes Israel de facto in 1949. And I think the fact that Turkey recognized so early Israel still has weight in how Israel is perceived in Turkey. Now, I know Israel's image has been tainted in Turkey, and if we look at public opinion polls, most people have a very negative opinion on Israel in Turkey. But still, we don't have in Turkey, like we had in Egypt, the elites saying that you cannot normalize relations with Israel. We don't have an up-down push to not have relations with Israel. What we do see, and I find it worrying in recent years, is that there is more BDS rhetoric in Turkey. Now, BDS is not unique to Turkey, but the BDS rhetoric that is entering Turkey is a rhetoric that does not accept Israel as a legitimate entity. And that is, I think, dangerous, because till now, Turkish public has been very consistent in his sympathy to the Palestinians. Actually, sometimes you see more sympathy in Turkey to the Palestinians than in some Arab countries. But in parallel, it did accept Israel as a legitimate entity, and it did promote. Basically, the talk was that the solution should be a two-state solution, but that means also that Israel is the legitimate entity. And as this BDS rhetoric is infiltrating Turkey, I think there is now more voices that do not accept Israel as a legitimate entity, and that's, of course, a big problem for me as an Israeli, but in general, of course, for Israel.
Is there another leader that compares to Erdogan in speaking against Israeli government actions?
In Turkey, you mean?
No, in general in the world, is there someone that speaks as forcefully as Erdoğan that maybe makes headlines in Israel?
Definitely, no. There are Zali there, the Spanish prime minister. We see also in South America countries that even cut their diplomatic relations with Israel. There are other actors, but definitely Erdogan has kept the Palestinian issue in the headlines, especially in the years of the Arab awakening, when because of all the turmoil in the different Arab states, there was less attention to the Palestinian issue.
Mm-hmm. And I have to ask about Israel's opposition. From what I understand, it's going through different challenges at the moment because there's so much going on in Israel. But how does Israel's opposition view Turkey and Turkish foreign policy?
Basically, there's a consensus in Israel with regard to Turkey. It's not an issue of difference between right and left, between opposition and coalition. When relations with Turkey were good in the 1990s and then Erdogan's first years in power, everybody supported it, both right and left. And recently, when Erdogan is very critical towards Israel and he uses very inflammatory terms towards Israeli politicians, then again you see that the condemnations are coming not only from the Likud party, the party of Netanyahu, but also from other parties like the Benny Gantz party or the Yair Lapid party. They also condemn Erdogan for speaking that way towards the Israeli prime minister. What I do see that is interesting is that, as you know, there is a protest in Israel for now going on for more than almost 2.5 years with regard to the judicial reform that this government is pushing. But for those who oppose it, it looks like they are basically trying to move Israel to authoritarian lines. And here, people, you do see plaques of Erdogan in these protests. With people and putting like Erdogan, half face Bibi Netanyahu, and basically warning the Israeli public that if you don't stop the government from doing what it wants, Israel will become Turkey in the sense of becoming more authoritarian.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that's opponents of Netanyahu say that he could become like Erdogan, just to clarify.
Yeah. But also, you know, when there was the protest after Imamoglu was arrested, these huge protests in Turkey, then also the protests in Israel got, look what's happening in Turkey. We should, if they are doing that in Turkey, then we should also continue our protest. And you see that the autocrats are learning from each other, but you also see that the protest movements around the world are learning from each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and then I have to ask about Hamas, because there's different Hamas representatives in Turkey. And I know it's very complex and there's not that much information about it that's public. But, you know, intelligence chief Ibrahim Kalin here in Turkey, he met with a Hamas member, Mohammed Darwash, on Sunday to negotiate ceasefire conditions. And how do you view this? Because from what I understand, it's potentially beneficial to have a country that can facilitate negotiations and have a place to meet between different officials of different nations regarding Israel and Gaza and Hamas. What is the view from Israel? Is it just that Turkey's facilitating Hamas members and sheltering them, or is there some kind of advantage too? How do you explain it?
So I have to differentiate between the period until October 7th and the period after. Before October 7th, Turkey's position was that Hamas is a political entity and that no solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can be achieved without having Hamas in the negotiations. And here, Israel was not happy about Hamas logistical activity held on Turkish territory, but it's sort of, and in some periods, Israel did raise concern about certain people, and when the relations were better, then Turkey was more receptive to Israel's concerns, and when relations were worse, Turkey was less receptive. But there was sort of no big issue on this. This was not a major issue of confrontation between Israel and Turkey. But after October 7th, basically, Israel does not want to see Hamas playing a role in the future Palestinian politics. Of course, Hamas is also an idea, and you can't kill an idea. But it does. the most majority of Israelis do not want to see that after Hamas did what it did on October 7th, it will have any role in Palestinian politics. And I think what is for me disturbing, as somebody following Turkey, which also has dealt with terror over the years and had terrible terror attacks, is that there's no rethinking of Hamas after October 7th, in the sense that whatever you think of what happened, definitely it caused a lot of suffering to the Palestinians, and sort of Hamas knew that with what it was doing, it was provoking Israel, and that once it provokes Israel, Israel will attack it, and then all the other elements of the resistance, of Iran will come into play. Hezbollah, Houthis, the militias in the Shiite militias in Iraq, and of course Iran itself, and there would be a big conflict against Israel. That was the idea of Hamas, but basically it put its population in risk. All this building of tunnels under this vast tunnel system under the population houses in Gaza. I mean, it put the population so much at risk. So I understand that the sympathy with the Palestinians, but is Hamas really doing a good for the Palestinians? I personally don't think so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, to just add context, Erdogan called them freedom fighters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if Israel-Turkey relations can recuperate from that. Can there be some kind of improvement? Because it feels like this is a bigger divide than we've seen before. I don't know. Would you say this is the farthest apart Turkey and Israel have been in their history as states?
Yeah, no, definitely. We can talk later about the economic ban Turkey imposed on Israel, complete economic ban Turkey imposed on Israel in May 2024. But definitely, we're in the lowest point we have been in the relationship. However, again, I think the Turkish public and also the Turkish leaders are empathic to the Palestinians. But empathy to the Palestinians does not equate empathy to Hamas. And if you look at public opinion polls, then only 30% of the Turkish public is empathic to Hamas. That's too much for me as the Israeli, I have to emphasize here. But still, that means 70% are also against Hamas. They understand that Hamas does not equate the Palestinians. So there is room to improve relations, and I wouldn't be so pessimistic.
Okay, so there's a possibility to return. Let's talk about trade, because from what I understand, and it's not much because I don't focus on Israel full time, Israel-Turkey trade is still going. It's going mainly to Palestinian territories. Is that what you understand? And there's also that Azerbaijan oil passing through Turkey, still going to Israel. Is this all accurate? How do you define Turkey-Israel trade?
Yeah, so Turkey, as I mentioned, imposed a full trade ban on Israel, and in May 2024, and this was unprecedented because during Erdogan's years, trade boomed between Israel and Turkey was Israel's fifth largest trade partner in the sense of imports. Israel imported a lot from Turkey, and in the mutual trade, 3/4 was Turkish exports to Israel, and only 1/4 was Israeli exports to Turkey. So this was overnight halted. Things do continue to arrive to Israel through third parties, through third countries, or, as you mentioned, through the Palestinian traders. Basically, of course, the Palestinian Authority doesn't have a port of its own, so these things arrive to Haifa and Ashdod ports in Israel, and then they are later resold to Israel. So Israel, the estimates are about less than half of the trade that existed before the war continues to flow. With regard to the oil, Azerbaijan has published its official statistics is that it's also halted oil trade, oil sales to Israel in the last few months. Here again, there are claims that that it is resold to Israel through third parties.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and from what I understood, before October 7th, Turkey exported a lot of food to Israel, right? Produce.
Everything. No, Israeli supermarkets were filled with his products. I had two products I liked, especially I had soap and laundry detergent. So I followed what was happening with these two products. So the laundry detergent is now imported from Spain. It's the same laundry detergent, but it's manufactured in Spain. That's what it has on the label. And the soap, there was a long time it was still there, but I guess it was in storage and was just out in the store. And now it's gone. So I need to get accustomed to a new soap.
Okay, so the supply chains are changing, basically.
So things are changing, but definitely because of the distance between Israel and Turkey. Israel was like a local market for Turkey. The distance was nothing. And yes, there were factories that were specifically manufacturing to the Israeli market. In Israel, there's the religious kosher certificate, like halal, but not exactly the same. And also other products, not just related to animals. But anyhow, so there were factories who had this kosher certificate that was meant for the Israeli market. They had labels in Hebrew. But it was not only food, it was textiles, it was cars that were international manufacturers, Toyota, Hyundai, that have the factories in Turkey. Then the cars were later sold to Israel. A lot of building materials. So actually, we saw a fall in the figures of trade between Israel and Turkey already before the war. There was a decrease compared to 2023, and when you try to analyze it, then basically there was a slowdown in the building industry in Israel, and that's why they need less building materials from Turkey.
Yeah. And if we have time, we can return to some of these consumer commercial relations, because there's also tourism, but let's put a hold on that. There's a question about Syria and whether Turkey and Israel can cooperate in the Syria theater. This is from Ricardo Gasco, a fellow researcher here in Turkey. He's also going into one of the questions I had for you, which is, how do you see Israeli policy in Syria in relation to the new government in Damascus? And as Ricardo asked, is there a place where there can be cooperation over Syria?
So let's start. There was indirect cooperation with the fall of Assad. I mean, Assad would not have fallen if Israel didn't weaken Hezbollah earlier. I mean, you had to have this weakening of Hezbollah for the push of the rebels to succeed. And of course, the rebels wouldn't have succeeded if Turkey wouldn't have assisted them throughout the year. So there was indirect cooperation here. And also now what Israel did with regard to Iran, weakening Iran is also good for Syria, because what is the danger for one of the dangers for Shara is that there will be Iranian attempts to topple him or weaken him. And if now Iran is weakened, it has less energy to operate in Syria. So I think definitely Israel and Turkey indirectly or directly are cooperating. Now, Israel at the beginning, I have to say, was very suspicious towards Ashara when Assad was toppled. And at the beginning, they called him a jihadist, that we can't talk with him, and we have to build up our defenses and entered even some Syrian territory, and we can't give it up until we know for sure that we don't have a jihadist threat coming from our northern border. But as time passed, and also with the influence of President Donald Trump and his decision to say that Ashara is a good guy and he should be supported and sanctions should be lifted and Israel should be reasonable. He says that to Netanyahu when they meet in Washington. Then Israel changes its stance, and now there are at least 4 directions of talks with the Ashara regime, and some of them are direct talks. Now, we shouldn't be over-optimistic in the sense that we're going to have peace between Israel and Syria. Some Turkish commentators and Syrian analysts have said it's not good for Ashara to move too fast with Israel. It can weaken him also. But there is talk about security arrangements between Israel and Syria, and hence Israel is going to be part of those who want Ashara to remain in power in the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and then the people I talked to about Syria security, some of them suggested that Turkey has been fairly restrained in the face of Israeli actions in Syria. There was bombing of different bases and weapon sites, but at the same time, Netanyahu, and correct me if I'm wrong, Netanyahu wants the south of Syria to be demilitarized, and Turkey hasn't really pushed back on that. Is that how you understand it?
So the issue of for Israel is more the airspace than what is happening on ground. Of course, on ground there is fear of terror infiltrating. There is fear, for example, that Hamas will take presence in Syria. But the big issue is the airspace and Israel's freedom of action in Syrian airspace. And in retrospect, when you see what Israel did in Iran, and you understand that part of again, according to what was published, some of the airplanes flew from Israel to Iran through Syria. You understand why Israel was so adamant that it doesn't want to see any Turkish jets in the south of Syria, because apparently they were planning this stuff. And then you see why the sensitivities were so strong in the airspace element. Now, unfortunately, I think we're not done. I mean, the Israeli-Iranian conflict is not over, so I'm not sure. I mean, these things Israel would still want to have, but I think when you understand the logic of Israel, you understand that it's not against Turkey, but rather against Iran. I think perhaps there is more understanding to the Israeli position.
Well, then we have Devlet Bahçeli saying everything's against Turkey, right? So depends on who you listen to and who you trust. So it gets very complicated, obviously, but let's make it more complicated by talking about the Kurdish issue. Obviously, you've heard about the Davut, what do they call it? The Davut corridor, the David corridor that Israel's trying to build with Kurds to undermine Turkish security. It's a conspiracy theory that may or may not have any factual relevance. But what do you make of the Israeli government's stance on the Turkey-PKK peace process? Where have they said anything about it? And if so, what is it?
I mean, Israel's relations with the Kurdish minorities around the region has been long-standing. It's part of Israel's founding father, Ben-Gurion's peripheral pact idea that Israel should have good relations with the non-Arab minorities in the region, because at the time, at Ben-Gurion, Israel's biggest threat was from the Arab countries. So Israel's relations with the Kurds are long-standing. Israel mostly had relations with the Kurds in northern Iraq and with the KDP.
Mm-hmm.
That is the historical context. With the PKK, on the contrary, like the story that was now published in the Middle East Eye about Öcalan and what Öcalan supposedly leaked remarks about the relations with Israel over the years. Israel considered the PKK as a cooperator of the PLO, and they trained together in Lebanon, and Israel did not see favorably the PKK. What perhaps changed some dimensions was, of course, what happened in the Syrian civil war and the formation of the SDF. And here, I think the story was different, and the SDF was also had actually publicly said that it was open to relations with Israel, and that was something new, because in the past, again, the PKK and Israel did not work together. But again, I think since things are moving in Syria so fast that what we said a few months ago is not relevant necessarily now. I think now is the direct context between the SDF and Ashara. That's the big issue. There's not going to be any David corridor, and I think this from the beginning. I think this is, as you said, conspiracy theories, but it's not going to happen.
So just to be clear, there's not that much discussion in Israeli media about this, because I see sometimes Kurdish militias being mentioned in Times of Israel or something like that. But is the Kurdish issue a factor in Israeli security thinking?
Well, in the beginning of when Assad was toppled, in the early days when there was fear that Turkey would attack directly the Kurdish areas, Kurdish-dominated areas, then there were statements of Israel's foreign minister, and there was concern. The PKK Turkey negotiations is not receiving a lot of attention. A little bit in the context of, look, this is a terror organization who decided to dissolve itself. When will Hamas do the same? I mean, that's the context that it's being discussed. But it doesn't get, again, we are in a war. We have hostages. We have, before Iran, we had missiles from the Houthis. It's not been discussed that much.
What about statements on the U.S. Decreasing its military presence in Syria? How's that viewed?
That's definitely a concern in Israel. From Israel's perspective, it wanted to see the U.S. Maintaining its base in Syria because it's considered that this is helping stabilize Syria and is a protection for the Kurds. But as you know, the U.S. has decided to decrease its forces, and probably only one base will remain. So in this respect, Israel did not manage to push the U.S. towards its position.
Yeah. And for the people watching, please send questions because there's so many topics to cover on this, and I'm not going to hit them all. So if you want something specific, please ask it. I wanted to also ask about the Gulf countries and the possibility for normalizing relations with Israel once the wars calm down a bit. If Saudi Arabia or UAE try to normalize relations with Israel one day in the future, what do you think that means for Turkey? And would that put pressure on Turkey to just follow along?
I think you had a mistake in what you mistakenly said UAE, but UAE we have, of course, we have, of course, sorry, there's the room. But so when the Abraham Accords were signed in 2020, definitely Turkey said it's against it and even threatened to have the UAE, its ambassador from the UAE, brought back to Ankara. But at the end of the day, very interestingly, we saw that the Abraham Accords were what was pushing Turkey towards normalization with Israel in 2022. Because Israel was in a position of strength and Turkey was at the time quite isolated. And this was actually what pushed Turkey to repair relations in 2022 with Israel. So I think if we do achieve a normalization with Saudi Arabia, this will also have a positive impact on Israeli Turkish relations. It will basically show, put Israel in a position of strength with regard to diplomatic strengths. I mean, not military strengths, but diplomatic strengths. And that will have also a positive effect on Turkey. But as I mentioned before, there's also the issue that we will not have a normalization with Saudi Arabia without having a Palestinian component. It's a no-go. So, and once we have a Palestinian component, then it's also easier for Turkey to repair relations with Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I've got kind of a big overarching question because Israel's a long-running topic for Erdoğan. I think it's the basis of a lot of his foreign policy and thinking. So I think it's something to talk about, and I'd appreciate some help from you and how you frame it, because as you know, Erdoğan often condemns Israel, but he's also condemning the United Nations and how the United Nations functions. So people that observe Turkish politics will know that Erdoğan often says the world is bigger than five. The world is bigger than five is his slogan, right? And that's often referring to the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council and their veto power. I think he's very often criticizing the US using its veto power to block different resolutions on Israel. I think it did so in June was the last time to block a ceasefire resolution. Was that the last one? Or have there been many? See, I'm not following it fully, but I do follow Erdoğan, and Erdoğan always argues that Muslims make up a quarter of the world. So at least one Muslim majority country deserves a seat at the table and should have veto power to make global decisions. It's the basis for his book, The Fairer World is Possible, right? So from the Israeli government point of view, what kind of world is it working towards? Because Erdogan's working towards that system, a reformed UN system. So where's the Israeli government positioning itself? Because there's a lot of discussion about what's going to happen after the Gaza war. Many rules-based norms are changing. So what is the Israeli government preparing for, basically, and what kind of changing world does it envision, and how's it going to operate in that?
As I said, I give lectures on Turkish politics and Turkish foreign relations. And when I get to the slide, the world is bigger than five, then nobody knows what I'm talking. I mean, nobody knew it from before. So this is something that is receiving zero attention in Israel, I must say. Israel is very suspicious towards the UN. Israel, basically, you talked about a quarter of the population being Muslim. We have only 16 million Jews. We only have one Jewish state. We have no chance in the UN, basically. The UN is considered totally biased against Israel. Israel has sometimes, from time to time, successes in the UN, but they're very sporadical. And basically, Israel thinks the UN is broken, but from other reasons that Erdoğan thinks. Israel is, for good or for worse, Israel is a very realpolitik actor. For the world we're entering, I think that's actually makes it's not bad for Israel because we're prepared for it, right? We have the shelter, we have the missile defense, we have the good air force. For the world we're entering, I think it's not a bad thing. But yeah, I mean, in terms of fair world, that's not something that Israel is promoting. Although, if you look at the international law, you know that there's a lot of influence of Jewish lawyers, and there was influence, of course, of the lessons from the Holocaust that influenced the way international law has developed. But in terms of the Israeli state, basically, it's quite given up on the UN, I must say.
Yeah, I mean, there's a book called The World After Gaza Now by Pankaj Mishra, where he criticizes the global order and the American power is declining. So, I mean, what's the discourse in Israel about a multipolar world? Because here in Turkey, it's an opportunity, but what does it represent there?
So for Israel, of course, the special relationship with the US is very important. This is one of the major topics for Israel decision making, and also in INSS, in what the think tank I work at, was the program on Israel-US relations is, of course, one of the top program. There is, of course, concerns what will happen if the US weakens, its international standing weakens. But every time you think things are going bad, then the events surprise you. And here we just, a week ago or a little bit more, we saw the US attacking Iran. So, and this was following Israeli actions against Iran. So, I mean, of course, if we look at public opinion polls in the US, we see the attitude, at least with regard to Democrats, is towards Israel has really changed, and that again is a source of concern. But we'll have to see. At the end of the day, what's good about Israel compared to other countries that are playing around, let's say, is that Israel knows that its security lies with the US. So it's not. So it may have some relationship with Russia and China from time to time. With Russia, it was regard to Syria, and with China, of course, there's an economic relationship. But at the end of the day, Israel knows that security is vested in having good relations with the US.
So, I mean, is there a risk for a severe break between Turkey and Israel in that bubble? Just to return to the beginning, because, Fidan Hakan is saying that the problem is Israel in the region. And that's a phrase repeated by many people, right? Here in Turkey and also in the region. So what do you do about that from an Israeli point of view? Because after Gaza, there's plenty of, blowback that can happen and security concerns. And I'm just wondering where Turkey-Israel relations and Turkey-US relations exist in that. It seems like security concerns are higher in the future than they are now.
I will completely agree that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is a big issue and an issue that should be solved and an issue that is causing so much suffering and really immediate suffering that should be stopped. I completely agree with that. But of course, the Middle East has other problems. Israel is not the I wouldn't even say it's the biggest problem in the region. This region suffers from a lot of problems, as the Arab awakening showed. And the weakness of the countries surrounding Israel is not because Israel is deliberately weakening them. They're weak because of internal problems inside them. I think that really, even if Turkey has this vision to be the leading force in the Middle East, if you want to be the leading force, you have to have working relations with Israel. And Erdogan understood that in his first and second term in power, and which he kept the relationship with Israel intact, and even some things deepened during his first and second terms in office. And again, you don't have to like Israel. And I understand there's a lot of negative feelings towards Israel, but Israel is still an important actor in the Middle East. And in many issues, it's a status quo actor, and that does not show revisionism. And if you want to advance things, and there's a lot of things to advance, for example, in the environmental issue, with regard to Syria, Israel can assist Syria on the water issue, which is a very difficult situation in Syria. Israel can be also part of the solution. Israel is not just the problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if there's no other questions from the audience, please send them now. Otherwise, I'm going to ask about tourism. I'm guessing before the war, before October 7th, I remember there was a lot of investment of Israeli tourism in Antalya. I'm guessing there's not the same tourism as before. Do you read anything about Israeli tourism in Turkey and visiting Turkey?
Yeah, so there's a travel alert to Turkey, the highest level of travel alerts to Israel, not only to Turkey, by the way. This is many countries Israelis are not supposed to go to, but basically Israelis are not supposed to go to Turkey. Before the trade ban on Israel in May 2024, already Turkish Airlines stopped flying to Israel. Now, of course, a lot of foreign airlines stopped flying to Israel after October 7th, but Turkey didn't show any signs of wanting to renew the flights. I mean, it kept the slots. For some time, it kept the slots. It paid for keeping the slots in the Ben Gurion airport, which is the major international airport in Israel. But it didn't resume the flights since then. We had also low-cost flying to Israel. And also the Israeli airline, it flew. There was a lot of issues between, since 2007 actually, issues between Israel and Turkey about Israeli security arrangements in Israeli air carriers in Turkey. And they were really only resolved in 2022. So there was a very brief period in which Israeli air carriers flew to Turkey, but that also stopped. So there's no direct connection between Israel and Turkey that, of course, affects the passage of people. There is still stories about Israeli tourists going to Turkey, and of course, there's also the Arab minority in Israel that does see Turkey as a favorable vacation spot. So they were also flying, but again, you couldn't do it directly. Interestingly, now that we had the war with Iran, the 12-day war with Iran, and basically Ben Gurion was shut. Nobody was flying in. You had to. There was very creative ways to arrive to Israel, or not that creative, but in Israeli standards, they were creative. And then there were stories about Israelis who flew with Turkish Airways to Sharm in the Sinai Peninsula to enter Israel. So that was there was a little boost in, I think, Israelis passing through Istanbul or going to Jordan, and from there land passage to Israel. But this was a very anecdotal story of the last 12-day war.
Mm-hmm. Good. I mean, did you want to add anything that I didn't ask about? Because I know we could talk forever, but I want to make sure that we hit the important points for now before closing.
Yeah, I think that there's now a book that came out of a Greek scholar called The First 62 Years of Turkish-Israeli Relations. It came out in Routledge. And I just finished reading this book, and I think what's interesting, and this echoes things that people said in the past, is that basically the honeymoon years in the Israeli-Turkish relations were the exception. Most of the time, the relations were not that great, And even in this honeymoon years, interestingly, it was also a challenging period. I mean, even when it was good, it was not that there were also challenges. But having said that, we still have diplomatic relations since 1949. They were not cut. The ambassadorial representatives level has been up and down, but the diplomatic relations remained. And I do really have the hunch that when relations between Israel and Turkey are good, or at least working, that's also, it has a good effect also on the Middle East. And we know that the Middle East needs every stabilizing element that can be added. So I hope we do return to some sort of working relations.
Great. Good point to end on. I'll end it there then. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your questions. And thank you to Gallia Lindenstrauss, a senior research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, an independent think tank affiliated with Tel Aviv University in Israel. If you missed part of this live show, you can find the full recording on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or just go to turkeyrecap.com in a few hours and it will be there. So with that, stay safe. Hope things calm down and see you next time.
Thank you very much. I hope Turkey Recap is amazing, and I hope one day there will be an Israel Recap that does such a good job like you're doing.
Let's talk about it. Bye-bye.